Imagine standing in a shower stall that measures exactly 4 feet by 6 feet. White ceramic tiles, 3 rows high, a single steel drain in the center, bolted down with 4 screws that had been there since 1991. The silence is absolute. The walls are 3 feet thick. This is Cell 21 in Altiplano Federal Social Readaptation Center, Mexico's most secure prison, built for 237 million pesos to contain the most dangerous criminals on Earth. On the morning of July 12, 2015, that drain cover was gone, and beneath it, investigators discovered something that would rewrite everything we thought we knew about the limits of human engineering. A concrete-lined shaft dropping 10 meters straight down, metal ladder rungs every 18 inches, and at the bottom, railway tracks stretching into darkness. What they found was not a desperate escape tunnel clawed out by desperate hands. What they found was 1.5 kilometers of industrial infrastructure, electric lighting every 50 meters, professional ventilation systems, a motorcycle mounted on rail wheels capable of carrying a man the entire distance in less than 20 minutes. This was not desperation. This was doctrine. And it had been operating beneath Mexico's most secure facility for 18 months without anyone above ground even suspecting it existed. Today, we open the classified files on the most sophisticated prison break in modern history. We examine the forensic evidence that reveals how patient engineering and geological understanding can make any barrier permeable, how authority that refuses to look in all directions can be systematically outflanked by forces that work in dimensions it chooses to ignore. This is the story of how the Earth itself became an accomplice, how gravity was recruited as a tool, how a shower drain became a portal to a shadow world that operates beneath everything we think we control. The shower stall measured exactly 4 feet by 6 feet, standard institutional dimensions, white ceramic tiles, 3 rows high, a single drain in the center, covered by a steel grate that had been bolted down with 4 screws. The same screws that had been there since the day the Altiplano Federal Social Readaptation Center opened its doors in 1991. On the morning of July 12, 2015, at precisely 6:15 a.m., Guard Captain Raul Mendoza made his routine cell check. Block 7, Cell 21. The bed was empty, the shower stall was empty, but the drain cover was gone. What Mendoza discovered when he looked down into that hole would redefine everything the Mexican state thought it knew about control. The shaft dropped straight down, 10 meters into the earth, smooth concrete walls, metal ladder rungs every 18 inches, and at the bottom, barely visible in the weak light filtering down from above, something that shouldn't exist. Railway tracks. The tunnel stretched for 1.5 kilometers, nearly a mile underground. It had electric lighting every 50 meters. Ventilation shafts, a drainage system that kept the passage bone dry even during the rainy season, and at its heart, a motorcycle mounted on modified rail wheels capable of carrying a man the entire distance in less than 20 minutes. This was not a desperate escape. This was infrastructure. The story begins not with the man who vanished, but with the ground beneath the most secure prison in Mexico. The Valle de Mexico sits on what geologists call a lacustrine basin, ancient lake bed, clay mixed with limestone, compressed over millennia into something sculptable yet stable. Dirt that holds its shape when you carve it, but soft enough to cut with hand tools if you know what you're doing. In 1989, when surveyors first walked the site that would become Altiplano Prison, they noted the soil composition in their reports. Excellent drainage, they wrote. Minimal seepage risk. Perfect for a maximum security facility that needed to stay dry in all weather. What they didn't note was how easy that same soil would be to excavate, how quietly it could be moved, how little water would accumulate in any void carved from its depths. The prison was built to contain the worst of Mexico's criminal element: drug kingpins, cartel leaders, men whose organizations moved billions of dollars and commanded armies. The architectural firm of Gonzalez, Herrera and Associates designed a fortress. Concrete walls 3 feet thick, electronic surveillance on every corridor, motion sensors, heat detectors, pressure plates beneath every floor. But those sensors ended at the foundation slab. The surveillance cameras pointed horizontally, not down. The blueprints showed meticulous detail for everything above ground level. Below the basement, the drawings went blank, white space on the page, as if the earth itself was irrelevant. The construction budget for Altiplano totaled 237 million pesos in 1991 currency. Adjusted for inflation, that's roughly 400 million pesos today. Line item 17 covered perimeter security. Line item 23 funded the camera network. Line item 41 paid for seismic monitoring to detect any attempts to break through the walls. There was no line item for subterranean surveillance. The prison opened on November 3, 1991, with a capacity of 738 inmates. Maximum security protocols, single cells, concrete and steel construction throughout. The warden's first report to the Federal Bureau of Prisons noted that the facility represented the future of corrections in Mexico. Total environmental control, complete isolation of dangerous elements from society. The report was filed in a cabinet that would gather dust for 24 years before anyone thought to ask what total control actually meant, whether it was possible to secure every dimension of space, whether authority could extend infinitely in all directions, or if it had natural limits that could be measured and exploited. The tools arrived over months, never all at once. A shipment of PVC pipe for a construction project 3 kilometers away. Electrical conduit for a telecommunications upgrade at a government office building. Steel railing for a parking garage in downtown Mexico City. Railway ties claimed for a private ranch project that existed only on paper. Each delivery was legitimate, each invoice properly processed, each purchase order signed by officials who had no reason to connect their individual approvals to any larger pattern. The pipe was not suspicious. The conduit raised no flags. The steel seemed routine. It was only when assembled in sequence, underground, that the purchases revealed their true purpose. The spoil removal followed the same principle. Distributed disposal. Truckloads of dirt and rubble vanishing into active construction sites across the Mexico City metropolitan area. Landfills that specialized in construction waste. Private property where the owners were paid cash for the right to dump clean fill. Never enough material from any single location to draw attention, never the same route twice. The excavation work followed Mexico's natural rhythm. Days were for rest. Nights belonged to labor. The work crews kept construction hours, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., when the prison was at its quietest, when the traffic above ground was lightest, when sound traveled least efficiently through the earth to the surface. Noise discipline was mathematical. The tunnel was dug with hand tools only. No mechanical equipment, no pneumatic drills, shovels wrapped in rubber to eliminate the ring of metal on stone. Progress measured in centimeters per night rather than meters. Patient work. The kind that compounds slowly but inevitably, like interest on a long-term investment. The breakthrough moment came not with explosion or drama, but with precision. After 11 months of excavation, the tunnel reached directly beneath the shower stall in cell 21. The diggers knew the exact location because they had the prison blueprints, not stolen documents or black market intelligence. Public records obtained through proper legal channels from the Mexico City Municipal Planning Office, which kept copies of all major construction projects in its archives. The shaft was cut from below, working upward through the foundation slab. Concrete saw, water cooling, diamond-tipped blade. Industrial technique performed by men who had learned their trades on legitimate job sites before applying their skills to unauthorized projects. The work took 3 nights. On the 4th night, the saw blade broke through into the shower stall drain system. For the first time in the facility's history, Altiplano Prison had a second exit. The ventilation system was what separated a crude tunnel from a piece of infrastructure. Air has to move or men die underground. The solution was elegant. Natural convection. The tunnel was dug at a precise gradient, declining exactly 1.7 degrees from the prison to the exit point. Not enough slope to create drainage problems, but sufficient to establish airflow. Heat rose from the tunnel lights. Warm air moved toward the exit. Cool air was drawn down through the shower drain to replace it. A gentle current that required no fans, No electricity beyond the lighting system, no mechanical components that could fail or make noise. Physics provided the ventilation for free. The lighting ran on a simple principle. One bulb every 50 meters, 40-watt incandescent bulbs. Enough illumination to see clearly, but not enough to create heat signatures that might be detected by thermal imaging equipment. The electrical system tapped into the prison's own power grid through a junction box in the basement utility room. A single wire, properly installed, drawing no more current than a couple of reading lamps. The mathematics of the project reveal its sophistication. The tunnel measured 1.5 kilometers in total length. It required the excavation of approximately 800 cubic meters of earth. The concrete lining used 14 tons of cement. The railway system consisted of 67 meters of track, 43 rail ties, and one modified motorcycle engine mounted on steel wheels. Construction time, 11 months. Construction crew, never more than 4 men working simultaneously. Total project cost, including materials, labor, and disposal, estimated at 2.3 million pesos. Less than 1% of what it had cost the government to build the prison itself. The exit point was chosen with the same care as everything else. A construction site 1.5 kilometers from the prison perimeter. A legitimate development project where concrete slabs were being poured for a small warehouse complex. One additional slab, mixed and finished to professional standards, covering the tunnel mouth. To any inspector, it looked like part of the authorized construction, which, according to all the paperwork, it was. The tunnel was complete by April 2015. For 3 months, it simply existed. A shadow infrastructure beneath one of Mexico's most secure facilities. Waiting. Ready for use at any moment, but patient enough to wait for the right moment. The moment when timing, weather, and opportunity align to turn a possibility into an inevitability. The final test came on a Tuesday night in June, a trial run with no intention of actual escape. Just verification that every system worked as designed. The shower drain cover lifted silently. The shaft dropped exactly 10 meters to the tunnel floor. The lighting system illuminated the entire passage without gaps or dark zones. The motorcycle engine started on the first try and ran whisper quiet on its rubber-wrapped wheels. The journey from prison to exit took 19 minutes and 37 seconds. Well within the window between guard rotations. Well within the time frame of a normal shower period. Fast enough to be practical. Slow enough to be safe. On the night of July 11, 2015, every variable was optimal. No precipitation in the forecast. Groundwater at seasonal lows. Guard schedules running exactly on time. Prison population calm and settled. No special activities or disturbances that might alter normal routines. At 11:43 p.m., exactly 17 minutes before the next scheduled cell check, the shower drain cover was removed for the last time. At 11:52 p.m., the motorcycle engine started in the tunnel below. At 12:11 a.m. on the morning of July 12th, the exit slab was pushed aside from beneath. By the time Guard Captain Mendoza discovered the empty cell at 6:15 a.m., the tunnel had been operational for over 6 hours. By the time investigators descended the shaft with proper lighting equipment, the exit had been sealed again from above, leaving no surface trace of what had occurred. The shower stall still measured 4 feet by 6 feet. The ceramic tiles were still white, still arranged in 3 neat rows. The only difference was the absence of a drain cover that had been in place for 24 years. A steel grate that had been so routine, so ordinary, so completely part of the background architecture that its removal created a void that seemed to swallow sound itself. What the investigators found when they finally rappelled down into the earth was not just a tunnel, but a statement, a proof of concept that demonstrated how patient engineering could make any barrier permeable, how authority that refused to look in all directions could be outflanked by those willing to work in dimensions it ignored. The rails stretched away into darkness in both directions, straight and true as any subway line. The walls were smooth concrete, professionally finished. The lighting was evenly spaced and functional. The ventilation kept the air fresh and moving. Every detail spoke of long-term planning and methodical execution. This was not desperation. This was doctrine. And it would take years for the Mexican state to fully comprehend what it meant for any structure, any system, any promise of absolute security to exist above ground that could be so comprehensively undermined from below. The tunnel breathed. Even after its discovery, even after investigators had descended to catalog every meter of its construction, air still moved through it. Physics continued to operate. The gradient still drew fresh air down through the prison shower drain and pushed stale air up through ventilation shafts that emerged in places the investigators were still trying to find. The earth remembered every cut, every ton of displaced soil, every hour of patient labor. It remembered because it had been permanently changed, carved and shaped and lined with concrete that would endure long after the headlines faded and the investigations concluded and the emergency security meetings ended with promises of new protocols and enhanced surveillance. But enhanced surveillance of what? More cameras pointed at the same walls? Additional sensors monitoring the same corridors? Increased guard rotations checking the same cells? The tunnel represented a question that surface-based security could never fully answer. How do you guard against threats that originate from dimensions you cannot see? The work had been industrial. The planning had been architectural. The execution had been patient. And the result had been inevitable. Not because the prison was poorly designed or inadequately staffed, but because authority has natural limits that can be precisely measured and systematically exploited by those willing to work in the spaces authority chooses not to examine. The morning shift at Altiplano Federal Social Readaptation Center began at 6 a.m. sharp, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Guard. Captain Raul Mendoza had walked the same route through Block 7 for 8 years, past Cell 19 where the light flickered, past Cell 20 where the door seal needed replacement, past Cell 21 where the most valuable prisoner in the Mexican correction system had slept every night since February 2014. Except on this morning, Cell 21 was empty. The bed was made with hospital corners, military precision, the blanket pulled tight enough to bounce a coin, the pillow placed exactly parallel to the headboard, everything regulation, everything normal, except for the occupant, who had simply ceased to exist sometime between the 11 p.m. count and the 6 a.m. check. Mendoza's flashlight beam swept the cell in a practiced pattern. Corners first, then the walls, then the ceiling, all present and accounted for. The light moved to the shower stall. White ceramic tiles reflected the beam back in orderly rows. The floor sloped gently toward the center, where water would drain through a steel grate that had been installed in 1991 and inspected monthly ever since. The grate was gone. The hole beneath was perfectly round, 38 centimeters in diameter, just wide enough for a man of average build to pass through if he turned his shoulders. The edges were clean. No rough concrete, no torn metal, no signs of forced entry or desperate clawing. Someone had removed the drain cover from below, working upward through the foundation with the patience and precision of a professional contractor. Mendoza keyed his radio. Protocol 17, missing prisoner, all units to their emergency stations. The prison locked down automatically. Steel doors slammed shut throughout the complex. Sirens echoed off concrete walls that had been designed to contain any disturbance, any riot, any attempt at escape through conventional means. But the sirens were meaningless now. They were alarms for a two-dimensional world, warning against threats that moved horizontally across the ground or vertically through the air. They had no relevance to a problem that had originated 10 meters below the foundation, in a space the architects had never considered worth securing. The hole breathed. As Mendoza crouched beside it with his flashlight, he could feel cool air rising from below, not the stale, dead air of a hastily dug burrow, but fresh air that moved with purpose, air that had been somewhere else and was going somewhere else, air that belonged to a system. The initial investigation was chaos masquerading as procedure. 37 guards, 17 administrators, 4 warden-level officials, and one federal inspector descended on Block 7 within the first hour. They measured the hole. They photographed the missing grate. They interviewed every inmate within 6 cells of the breach. They tested the remaining shower drains throughout the facility to ensure no additional compromises existed, but nobody descended. The hole was too narrow for the riot gear the guards wore during emergency responses. The ladder rungs were visible, but they disappeared into darkness beyond the reach of any flashlight. Standard procedure called for specialized equipment. Rappelling gear, professional cave rescue technicians, safety protocols that would take hours to implement properly, hours during which the trail grew cold, hours during which evidence could be removed or destroyed, hours during which the full scope of the breach remained unknown to the authorities whose primary responsibility was knowing everything that occurred within their walls. The motorcycle was discovered at 2:30 p.m., 8.5 hours after the empty cell was found. Not by guards or investigators, but by a maintenance worker who had been sent down with proper spelunking equipment to assess what everyone assumed would be a crude tunnel dug by desperate hands. What Carlos Vega found at the bottom of the shaft changed his understanding of what was possible beneath the surface of the modern world. The tunnel stretched in both directions beyond his light. Straight walls, level floor, railway tracks that gleamed dully in the beam of his headlamp, and 30 meters from the base of the shaft, sitting motionless on the rails like a sculpture in an underground museum, a Honda motorcycle mounted on modified wheels. The machine was not crude. It was not improvised. It was not the desperate contraption of men who had run out of options. The engine was a 4-stroke, 250 cubic centimeter unit, commercial grade, the kind used in dirt bikes designed for rugged terrain and reliable operation. The wheels were precision machined, steel rims wrapped with rubber that had been carefully selected to minimize noise when rolling over metal rails. The entire assembly weighed approximately 160 kilograms. It had been lowered down the shaft in pieces and assembled underground by hands that knew exactly what they were doing. The engine compartment showed signs of modification, sound-dampening material, exhaust routing that vented outside the tunnel system, fuel injection tuned for maximum torque at low speeds rather than high-end performance. This was not a vehicle. This was industrial equipment designed for a specific job in a specific environment by people who understood both the requirements and the constraints of underground transportation. Vega's radio crackled to life as he approached the motorcycle. His supervisor's voice echoed strangely in the tunnel space. "What do you see down there?" The question hung in the air like dust. What did he see? He saw evidence of planning that stretched back months or years. He saw engineering that rivaled anything the prison itself had required. He saw proof that the earth beneath Mexico's most secure facility had been conquered and colonized by an invisible force that worked with the patience of geological time and the precision of Swiss clockwork. But what he said into his radio was simply, "You need to send more people." The tunnel ran northeast from the shaft. Vega followed it slowly, his headlamp sweeping from rail to rail, wall to wall, checking every detail. The construction was flawless. Concrete lined every surface. Not poured concrete, but hand-troweled concrete applied with the care of artisans who took pride in work that would never be seen by anyone except the people who used it. Every 50 meters exactly, a light fixture hung from the ceiling, 40-watt bulbs in weatherproof housings. The electrical work was professional, proper conduit, proper connections, no exposed wiring, no jury-rigged splices. Every junction box was labeled in neat handwriting that indicated the installation had been done by people who expected the system to operate for years without maintenance problems. The ventilation was natural but calculated. The tunnel declined at a precise angle that created airflow without requiring mechanical assistance. Warm air from the lights rose and moved toward the exit. Cool air entered through the drain shaft to replace it. A gentle but constant circulation that would prevent the accumulation of dangerous gases or humidity that could damage the electrical system or the rail infrastructure. At 400 meters from the shaft, Vega discovered the first of 3 emergency alcoves. spaces carved into the tunnel wall where a person could step aside if another person or vehicle needed to pass. The alcoves were finished with the same care as the main tunnel. Concrete walls, electrical outlets for maintenance equipment, ventilation that connected to the main airflow system. Someone had planned for traffic control in a tunnel that officially didn't exist. The construction debris told its own story. Nothing had been wasted. Every piece of concrete had been cut to precise dimensions before installation. Every section of rail had been measured and fitted exactly. The work showed no signs of haste or improvisation. No do-overs, no mistakes that required correction. Each element had been planned, prepared, and installed correctly the first time. At 800 meters, Vega found the storage depot, a widened section of tunnel where materials had been stockpiled during construction. Bags of cement stacked neatly against one wall. Coils of electrical wire organized by gauge and type. Sections of steel rail lined up like lumber in a construction yard. Even after the project was complete, the storage area remained organized, ready for maintenance, ready for expansion, ready for whatever the tunnel might require in the years ahead. This was infrastructure built to last, built to serve multiple purposes, built by people who understood that underground transportation was not a one-time emergency measure but a permanent alternative to surface movement. A parallel system that could operate indefinitely beneath the official world that continued to believe in the effectiveness of walls and cameras and guards. At 1,000 meters, the tunnel curved slightly to the left. Not a sharp turn, but a gentle arc that followed the natural contours of the land above. Someone had surveyed the route carefully before beginning excavation. Someone had studied topographical maps and geological surveys and property boundaries to design a path that would encounter the minimum number of obstacles while remaining completely invisible from the surface. The curve was where Vega realized he was lost. Not lost in the sense of not knowing which direction led back to the shaft, but lost in the sense of having entered a world that operated according to different rules than the one above ground. Down here, authority belonged to whoever had done the work. The tunnel was their territory, their creation, their proof that the earth could be claimed and shaped by anyone willing to invest the time and effort required to dig deeper than official power cared to look. At 1,200 meters, the rails began to climb. The same gentle gradient that had created the ventilation system now worked in reverse, lifting the tunnel toward whatever exit point waited ahead. The electrical system continued without interruption. The concrete lining remained perfect. But now Vega could feel the weight of the earth pressing down on him differently. He was rising back toward the surface world, but not to the same surface world he had left behind at the shaft. He was approaching enemy territory. Or rather, he was approaching the territory of people who had successfully made themselves enemies of the system that employed him. People who had demonstrated that all of his training, all of his equipment, all of his institutional authority meant nothing when confronted with the simple fact of patient work applied consistently over time in directions authority had chosen not to examine. At 1,300 meters, Vega's radio died. Whether from distance, interference, or deliberate jamming, he couldn't tell. But the silence was complete. He was alone in the tunnel, with nothing but his headlamp, and the knowledge that he was walking through a masterpiece of illicit engineering that had operated successfully beneath Mexico's highest security facility for months or years, without anyone above ground even suspecting it existed. The motorcycle tracks in the dirt between the rails showed recent use, fresh tire marks, oil spots where the engine had dripped during idle periods, fuel stains where someone had topped off the tank before the final ride. The evidence was all around him, but it led in only one direction, forward, toward an exit he couldn't see but knew must exist somewhere ahead in the darkness. At 1,400 meters, the tunnel began to feel different. The air moved faster. The sound of his footsteps changed subtly. The headlamp beam seemed to travel farther before hitting a wall or obstacle. He was approaching a larger space, a terminus, a place where the underground world connected back to the surface world through an opening that had been as carefully planned and precisely executed as everything else he had seen. The exit shaft appeared suddenly in his light. Another perfect circle cut through concrete and earth, rising vertically toward a distant square of gray that might have been daylight or might have been artificial illumination. Another set of ladder rungs, spaced exactly like the ones that had brought him down from cell 21. Another example of industrial precision applied to unauthorized purposes. But Vega didn't climb. His orders were to map the tunnel, not to explore beyond the prison perimeter. His radio was dead. His backup team was 1,400 meters behind him, and he was standing in a space that belonged to people who had demonstrated their willingness to invest enormous resources in projects that required absolute secrecy to remain effective. Instead, he turned around and began the long walk back to the shaft beneath Block 7, back to the world of official reports and emergency procedures and security upgrades that would try to address the implications of what he had discovered. Back to a surface that would never again feel quite as solid as it had before he learned what was possible in the spaces beneath it. The return journey took 43 minutes. When he finally emerged from the shaft in cell 21, blinking in the harsh fluorescent light of the shower stall, 3 assistant wardens and a federal inspector were waiting for him. They asked what he had found. They asked how extensive the tunnel was. They asked whether there were signs of ongoing activity or additional security breaches. What they didn't ask was whether the tunnel had changed his understanding of what security meant, whether he now realized that every building, every facility, every promise of total control existed in permanent vulnerability to forces that worked with the patience of water cutting through stone, whether he understood that the ground beneath their feet was not neutral territory but contested space that belonged to whoever was willing to work in it most persistently. The motorcycle was removed from the tunnel that evening, cut into pieces small enough to fit up the shaft and reassembled above ground for forensic analysis. The engine had been modified by professionals. The frame showed signs of careful welding and precision machining. The wheels had been custom fabricated to precise specifications for railway operation. Every component told the same story. This project had been undertaken by people with access to industrial facilities, technical expertise, and sufficient financial resources to purchase commercial-grade equipment and modify it for specialized applications. This was not the work of desperate men scraping at concrete with improvised tools. This was the work of an organization that understood engineering as a discipline and applied it to problems that required engineering solutions. The tunnel itself would remain, too large to fill efficiently, too complex to fully map without months of additional investigation, too expensive to secure properly without rebuilding the entire prison from the foundation up. It would become a monument to the limitations of surface-based authority and a permanent reminder that control over three-dimensional space required surveillance in 3 dimensions. But for now, it was simply evidence. Evidence of possibility. Evidence of planning. Evidence that the Earth itself could be recruited as an accomplice by anyone willing to speak its language of pressure and time and gradual, inevitable change. The concrete walls that had been carved with such precision would endure long after the investigations ended, and the security consultants submitted their reports and the emergency protocols were updated to address newly recognized threats. The rails would remain in place, waiting for whatever future use someone might find for them. The electrical system would continue to operate, drawing power from the prison's own grid to illuminate a space that had never appeared on any official blueprint. The tunnel had become permanent infrastructure, a shadow beneath the official world, a proof of concept that could not be erased simply by changing policies or increasing budgets or hiring additional guards. It existed. It worked. And its existence demonstrated possibilities that would never again be completely theoretical for anyone who chose to think seriously about the relationship between authority and the ground on which authority stood. In the weeks that followed, investigators would trace the procurement records. They would identify the construction sites where spoil had been disposed of. They would interview suppliers and contractors and municipal officials who had processed permits and approved deliveries. They would reconstruct a timeline that showed months of careful preparation executed by people who understood exactly what they were doing at every step of the process. What they would not reconstruct was the certainty that had existed before Guard Captain Mendoza discovered that empty cell. The certainty that walls were impermeable and foundations were permanent and maximum security meant control over all possible vectors of movement. That certainty had vanished down a 38-centimeter hole and could never be fully recovered, no matter how many tons of concrete were eventually used to fill the void. The shower stall was sealed. The drain was permanently capped. The cell was reinforced with sensors that would detect any vibration or temperature change that might indicate renewed excavation activity. But the knowledge remained that beneath every sensor, beneath every reinforcement, beneath every new security measure, the earth waited with the same patient readiness to be carved and shaped by anyone willing to invest the time and effort required to work in the dimension that authority found most difficult to observe. The tunnel breathed. Long after the investigation teams departed and the emergency protocols were filed and the budget requests were submitted for enhanced subterranean security systems, air continued to move through the passage. Physics continued to operate according to principles that recognized no authority except the laws that governed pressure and temperature and the movement of fluids through spaces designed to accommodate them. And in that breathing, in that persistence of function long after function was no longer officially required, lay the tunnel's most profound statement about the relationship between surface and depth, between visibility and control, between the world authority could see and the world authority preferred to ignore. The emergency meeting convened at 7 a.m. in Conference Room B of the Federal Bureau of Prisons headquarters. 16 officials around a mahogany table that had witnessed discussions about budget allocations and personnel transfers and routine administrative matters. Nothing in the room's institutional beige walls suggested it would host a conversation that would fundamentally alter Mexico's understanding of what maximum security actually meant. Warden Miguel Santos sat at the head of the table with the expression of a man whose career had just developed a crater. For 8 years, Altiplano had been his masterpiece. 0 successful escapes, 0 major riots, 0 incidents that made national headlines or prompted uncomfortable questions from oversight committees. His facility had been the model that other wardens studied and tried to replicate. Now his facility was the site of the most sophisticated escape in the history of modern corrections. An escape that had made his security protocols look like suggestions and his surveillance systems look like decorative accessories. An escape that demonstrated the existence of an entire parallel infrastructure beneath the building he thought he controlled completely. The forensic report lay open in front of him. 47 pages of technical analysis that reduced the previous night's crisis to measurements and photographs and engineering diagrams. The tunnel was 1,481 meters long. The motorcycle had a top speed of approximately 40 kilometers per hour on rails. The electrical system drew 320 watts of power from the prison's main grid. But the numbers didn't capture the real scope of the problem. The real problem was philosophical. If a maximum security facility could be tunneled under with industrial precision and operated beneath for months without detection, then what did maximum security actually mean? What did any security mean if it only accounted for threats that moved horizontally across the ground or vertically through the air? Deputy Director Carmen Ruiz spoke first. Her voice carried the careful neutrality of someone who had spent 30 years in corrections and understood that blame would eventually need to be assigned, but that assigning it too quickly could interfere with understanding what had actually happened. The preliminary investigation suggests this was not a spontaneous event, she said, consulting notes that she had been taking since 3 a.m. The tunnel shows evidence of construction over an extended period. Months, possibly years. The materials alone represent a significant investment. The labor required would have involved multiple individuals with specialized skills. The phrase hung in the air like smoke. Multiple individuals with specialized skills. Not desperate prisoners clawing at walls with improvised tools. Not a lucky accident that had stumbled upon a weakness in the foundation. An organization. A project. A deliberate campaign to undermine the most secure facility in the Mexican correction system using methods that the facility had never been designed to detect or prevent. Warden Santos cleared his throat. The sound echoed strangely in the conference room, as if the walls themselves were uncertain about their ability to contain what was being discussed. "What concerns me," he said slowly, "is the sophistication of the intelligence required to plan this operation. The tunnel terminates exactly beneath cell 21, not cell 20 or cell 22, the specific cell occupied by our most valuable prisoner. Someone had detailed knowledge of our housing assignments, our cell layouts, our security rotations. The implication was clear but unspoken. This had been an inside job, or at least a job that had required inside information. Information that could only have come from people with access to classified operational details that were supposed to be known only to authorized personnel. But which personnel? The housing assignments were known to dozens of guards, administrators, and support staff. The architectural plans were filed with municipal offices and construction companies and regulatory agencies. The security rotation schedules were distributed to supervisors and shift commanders throughout the facility. Any one of hundreds of people could have provided the intelligence necessary to plan the tunnel, which meant that any one of hundreds of people could have been compromised, which meant that the breach represented not just a failure of physical security, but a failure of personnel security that extended throughout the entire institutional structure. Inspector General Rodriguez opened a thick folder and withdrew a series of photographs, high-resolution images of the tunnel interior taken by the forensic team. The pictures showed details that the initial reports had only hinted at. The quality of the concrete work, the precision of the electrical installation, the professional finish on every surface. This was not constructed by amateurs, Rodriguez said, passing the photographs around the table. The concrete shows evidence of professional mixing and application. The electrical work meets or exceeds commercial building codes. The rail installation required specialized tools and expertise that you don't acquire overnight. The photographs told a story of patient craftsmanship applied to unauthorized purposes. Every image showed evidence of careful planning and skilled execution. No shortcuts, no compromise with quality, no signs that the builders had been working under pressure or with inadequate resources. This had been a long-term project undertaken by people who had all the time and money they needed to do the job properly. People who understood that cutting corners would create weaknesses that could be discovered. People who preferred to invest additional effort up front rather than risk failure during the critical operational phase. Secretary of Justice Martinez had been silent through the first hour of the meeting. His presence indicated that the escape had already reached the highest levels of government attention. His silence indicated that he was still processing the implications of what he was hearing. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who understood that this conversation would eventually be repeated in front of congressional committees and investigative journalists and political opponents who would use every detail as evidence of systemic failure. "What are we telling the press?" he asked. The question crystallized the immediate problem. The tunnel was a fact that could not be hidden or minimized. Too many people had seen it. Too much evidence existed. Too many investigators were involved to maintain any kind of cover-up or official denial. But how do you explain to the public that their most secure prison had been operating for months with an unauthorized railway system running beneath it? How do you maintain confidence in corrections when the correction system has been demonstrated to be permeable in directions it never thought to guard against? Deputy Director Ruiz consulted another set of notes. Media strategy was not her expertise, but she understood the political dimensions of crisis management. The initial statement focuses on the unprecedented nature of the breach, she said. We emphasize that this represents a level of planning and resources that exceeds anything in the historical record. We position it as an anomaly rather than evidence of systemic vulnerability. But even as she spoke, everyone in the room understood that the anomaly explanation would not hold up under serious scrutiny. If one tunnel could be built beneath one maximum security facility, then other tunnels could be built beneath other facilities. If the Earth could be conquered once by patience and engineering, it could be conquered again by anyone willing to make the necessary investment. The escape had revealed a vulnerability that was not specific to Altiplano. It was a vulnerability inherent in any security system that focused on surface threats while ignoring subterranean possibilities. A vulnerability that existed beneath every prison, every courthouse, every government building that had been designed to contain people or protect assets or control territory. Inspector General Rodriguez raised the question that everyone had been avoiding. How many other facilities need to be inspected for similar vulnerabilities? He asked. The silence that followed was answer enough. Every major prison in Mexico would now require subterranean security assessments, ground-penetrating radar, seismic monitoring, geological surveys to identify soil conditions that might be conducive to tunnel construction, security protocols that accounted for three-dimensional rather than two-dimensional threats. The cost would be enormous. The time required would stretch over years. And even after all the assessments were complete and all the new security measures were implemented, the fundamental problem would remain. The Earth itself was not neutral territory but contested space that belonged to whoever was willing to work in it most persistently. Warden Santos asked the question that cut to the heart of the operational problem. What do we do about the tunnel that already exists? The tunnel could not simply be ignored. It represented a permanent breach in the facility's security perimeter, but it also could not be easily secured. Too large to fill completely, too complex to monitor effectively, too expensive to rebuild from scratch. The forensic team had recommended sealing both ends and installing sensors throughout the passage to detect any future activity, but sensors could be defeated by anyone with sufficient technical knowledge, and the people who had built the tunnel had already demonstrated technical knowledge that exceeded anything the prison's security staff had encountered before. Deputy Director Ruiz suggested a different approach. "We use it," she said. "We turn it into an asset rather than a liability. Controlled access for training purposes, a laboratory for developing countermeasures against similar threats, a way to understand tunnel-based security breaches by studying the most sophisticated example ever discovered." The suggestion had merit, but it also had risks. Converting the tunnel into a training facility would require acknowledging its existence permanently. It would mean admitting that the breach had been successful enough to serve as a model for future security planning. It would transform a symbol of failure into a symbol of institutional learning, but only if the institution was willing to accept that failure as a permanent part of its identity. Secretary Martinez asked the question that would determine how the crisis was ultimately managed. "Do we have any intelligence about who built this?" The answer was complicated. The investigation had identified dozens of suppliers who had provided materials used in the construction, hundreds of workers who had been employed at construction sites where spoil from the tunnel had been disposed of, thousands of people who had been in position to observe some aspect of the operation over the months it had required to complete. But intelligence about the organization that had coordinated all these activities remained fragmentary. Shell companies that had existed long enough to process purchase orders and then dissolved, cash payments that left no paper trail beyond the initial transaction, workers who had been hired for specific tasks without being told how their work connected to any larger project. The tunnel represented the operational signature of an organization that understood operational security as thoroughly as it understood engineering. An organization that had planned not just the construction phase, but the investigation phase, designing the project to reveal as little as possible about its own structure and capabilities even after it was discovered. Inspector General Rodriguez opened another folder and withdrew a map of Mexico City. Red pins marked locations where tunnel-related materials had been purchased or delivered. Blue pins marked construction sites where spoil had been disposed of. Yellow pins marked addresses associated with companies that had been involved in various aspects of the supply chain. The pins were scattered across the entire metropolitan area. No obvious pattern. No geographic concentration that might indicate a headquarters or operational base. The tunnel project had been distributed across dozens of legitimate businesses and hundreds of individual transactions in a way that made it nearly impossible to trace back to any central organizing authority. "What we're looking at," Rodriguez said, "is evidence of an organization that thinks systematically about security and operates with a level of operational discipline that rivals anything we see in law enforcement or intelligence services." The comparison was uncomfortable but accurate. The tunnel represented better operational security than most official operations achieved. Better planning, better execution, better post-operational cleanup. It was a masterclass in clandestine project management applied to unauthorized purposes by people who understood that success required attention to details that legitimate organizations often overlooked. The meeting continued for another 3 hours. Budget discussions, personnel reassignments, protocol revisions, emergency measures that would be implemented immediately, and long-term reforms that would require months or years to fully develop and deploy. But the fundamental problem remained unchanged. The earth beneath Mexico's maximum security facilities had been demonstrated to be permeable to anyone willing to invest sufficient time and resources in learning how to work with it. That permeability could not be eliminated by policy changes or budget increases or personnel reforms. It was a geological fact that had become a security fact, and security facts, once established, could never be completely forgotten or overcome. They became part of the permanent tactical environment that any serious adversary would consider when planning operations against facilities that had been proven vulnerable in dimensions their designers had never thought to secure. The tunnel had changed everything, not just at Altiplano, but throughout the Mexican correction system, not just for the current crisis, but for every future security assessment and threat evaluation and infrastructure planning decision that would be made in the years ahead. The conference room emptied slowly. Officials departed with assignments and deadlines and a shared understanding that the conversation they had just concluded would be repeated in various forms for months or years as the implications of the escape continued to unfold through the political and administrative systems that were supposed to maintain control over people and places and situations. But the tunnel would outlast all the meetings. It would remain in place long after the investigations were completed and the reports were filed and the new security measures were implemented, a permanent reminder that authority over surface territory did not automatically extend to the space beneath the surface, a proof of concept that could not be eliminated by administrative action or legislative reform. The concrete walls would endure. The rail system would remain functional. The electrical infrastructure would continue to draw power from the prison's grid. And somewhere in the darkness beneath Mexico's most secure facility, air would continue to move according to principles of physics that recognized no authority except the laws that governed pressure and temperature and the movement of fluids through spaces designed to accommodate them. The tunnel breathed. It had been designed to breathe, and it would continue to breathe long after everyone who had built it was dead, and everyone who had discovered it was forgotten, and everyone who had tried to understand its implications had moved on to other problems and other crises and other proofs that the world contained possibilities that official thinking preferred not to acknowledge. The congressional hearing room smelled of old wood and fresh coffee, and the nervous sweat of officials who had been summoned to explain the unexplainable. Representative Elena Vasquez sat behind the curved dais that elevated the committee members above the witness table where Secretary of Justice Martinez adjusted his tie for the 4th time in 10 minutes. The room held 237 people, reporters with notebooks and cameras, congressional staff with briefing folders thick enough to stop bullets, observers who had come to witness what promised to be either a masterclass in political accountability or a masterclass in political theater. The distinction would depend entirely on whether the questions produced answers that mattered or answers that merely sounded impressive. Representative Vasquez gavelled the hearing to order at 9 a.m. sharp. Her voice carried the authority of someone who had spent 12 years asking uncomfortable questions of people who preferred not to answer them. "The purpose of this hearing," she said, reading from prepared remarks that had been refined through multiple drafts by staff members who understood the political implications of every word choice, "is to examine the security breach at Altiplano Federal Social Readaptation Center and to determine what systemic reforms are necessary to prevent similar incidents in the future." But everyone in the room understood that the real purpose was to establish who would be blamed for an escape that had made Mexico look like a country that couldn't secure its own prisons against people who knew how to dig holes and lay railroad tracks. The political implications extended far beyond corrections policy. This was about competence, about whether the current administration could be trusted to maintain basic governmental functions. Secretary Martinez opened his prepared statement with statistics. Mexico operated 366 federal and state correctional facilities. They housed approximately 214,000 inmates. The annual budget for corrections exceeded 8 billion pesos. In the previous fiscal year, the escape rate had been less than 0.2%. The numbers were designed to provide context, to position the Altiplano breach as an isolated incident rather than evidence of systemic failure, to demonstrate that the vast majority of Mexico's prisoners remained securely contained despite the spectacular exception that had captured international attention and made the country's correction system a subject of global ridicule. But Representative Vasquez was not interested in statistics about successful containment. She was interested in the one case where containment had failed so completely that it had revealed fundamental assumptions about security to be worthless. "Secretary Martinez," she said, consulting notes that had been prepared by staff members who had spent weeks studying every aspect of the case, "the tunnel discovered beneath Altiplano Prison represents a level of engineering sophistication that suggests extensive planning and professional expertise. What intelligence do we have about the organization responsible for this construction project?" The question was precisely calibrated to create maximum discomfort. Intelligence about criminal organizations was sensitive information that could not be discussed in detail during televised hearings. But the absence of intelligence was a different kind of sensitive information that suggested institutional failure or incompetence. Martinez chose his words carefully. "The investigation is ongoing. We have identified multiple suppliers and contractors who provided materials used in the construction. We have traced financial transactions associated with various aspects of the project. We are working with law enforcement agencies to develop a comprehensive understanding of how this operation was planned and executed." The answer was accurate but unsatisfying. It acknowledged investigative activity without revealing investigative results. It promised future understanding while admitting current ignorance. It was the kind of response that congressional committees were designed to dissect and expose. Representative Gonzalez, the ranking minority member, asked the question that cut to the operational heart of the matter. How long was this tunnel under construction before it was discovered? Martinez consulted briefing materials that had been prepared by teams of analysts who had spent months reconstructing the timeline of the operation. "Based on forensic evidence, we estimate construction began approximately 18 months before the breach was discovered. The tunnel represents approximately 800 cubic meters of excavated material and required the installation of sophisticated electrical, ventilation, and transportation systems." 18 months. The number hung in the air like an accusation. For 18 months, people had been digging beneath Mexico's most secure prison. For 18 months, materials had been delivered and workers had been employed, and progress had been made on a project that would ultimately demonstrate the complete inadequacy of surface-based security measures. For 18 months, everyone responsible for prison security had been operating under the assumption that their facility was impermeable while an unauthorized railway system was being built in the basement. Representative Vasquez pressed the temporal implications. During those 18 months, how many security inspections were conducted at Altiplano? Martinez's staff had anticipated this question. The briefing materials included detailed records of every inspection, audit, and assessment that had been conducted during the relevant period. Altiplano underwent quarterly security reviews by the Federal Bureau of Prisons, annual audits by the Ministry of Justice, semi-annual assessments by independent security consultants, monthly inspections by facility management, weekly reviews by shift supervisors. The list was impressive. It demonstrated institutional commitment to oversight and quality control. It showed that the prison had been subject to constant scrutiny by multiple layers of authority, all of whom had certified its security as adequate or exemplary. But none of those inspections had detected the existence of a tunnel that stretched for nearly a mile beneath the facility. None of those audits had identified the unauthorized power consumption that had been used to light the underground passage. None of those assessments had noticed the subtle changes in airflow that had indicated the presence of ventilation shafts hidden throughout the complex. Representative Jimenez asked the question that everyone was thinking but nobody wanted to voice directly. Were any of these inspections designed to detect subterranean threats? The answer was no, but saying no would be an admission that Mexico's security protocols had a blind spot large enough to accommodate industrial construction projects. So Martinez provided context instead. Traditional prison security focuses on preventing escape attempts through walls, fences, and other visible barriers. The Altiplano incident represents the first time in Mexican corrections history that inmates have attempted escape through underground tunnels of this sophistication. The explanation was reasonable but inadequate. It acknowledged that the security protocols had been designed for different threats than the one they had actually encountered, but it didn't explain why threats that had been considered theoretical or impossible in Mexico had been considered serious enough to guard against in other countries with comparable security challenges. The United States had been installing subterranean monitoring systems in federal prisons since the 1990s. Israel had been using ground-penetrating radar to detect tunnel construction since the 1980s. European correction systems had been incorporating three-dimensional security protocols since the early 2000s. Mexico had been operating under the assumption that its prisoners either lacked the resources to attempt tunnel construction or lacked the expertise to execute such projects successfully. Both assumptions had been proven catastrophically wrong. Representative Vasquez introduced evidence that her staff had spent weeks gathering purchase orders for materials that had been delivered to addresses associated with shell companies, work permits for construction projects that had existed on paper but never been built, vehicle registrations for trucks that had been used to transport tunnel spoil to disposal sites throughout the Mexico City metropolitan area. The documentary evidence painted a picture of systematic planning and coordination that had extended far beyond the prison itself. The tunnel had been the visible component of a much larger operation that had involved dozens of businesses, hundreds of workers, and thousands of individual transactions spread across multiple states and municipalities. What this evidence suggests, Representative Vasquez said, is that we are not dealing with a simple escape attempt, but with an organization that has the capability to plan and execute complex infrastructure projects while maintaining operational security that prevented detection by law enforcement and intelligence agencies. The implication was clear. This was not just a corrections problem. This was a national security problem. An organization that could build unauthorized railways beneath maximum security facilities could build unauthorized infrastructure beneath other sensitive locations. Government buildings, military installations, border control stations. If the earth beneath Mexico's prisons could be colonized without detection, then the earth beneath Mexico's critical infrastructure could be colonized as well. The tunnel had demonstrated possibilities that extended far beyond the corrections context where it had been discovered. Secretary Martinez acknowledged the broader implications while trying to maintain focus on the immediate problem. We have initiated comprehensive security assessments at all federal correctional facilities. We are implementing enhanced monitoring systems designed to detect subterranean activity. We are coordinating with intelligence agencies to develop better understanding of organizations with the capability to undertake projects of this complexity. But the measures he described were reactive rather than proactive. They addressed the threat that had already been demonstrated rather than the threats that might exist in forms that had not yet been imagined. They assumed that tunnel construction was the extent of the problem, rather than simply the first example of what was possible when patient engineering was applied to unauthorized purposes. Representative Gonzalez asked the question that would determine the political consequences of the hearing. Who bears responsibility for this failure? The question was designed to force accountability. Someone had to be held responsible for an escape that had made Mexico a subject of international ridicule. Someone had to be blamed for security failures that had allowed industrial construction beneath a maximum security facility. But accountability was complicated when the failure involved threats that had never been anticipated by the people who designed the security protocols. How do you hold officials responsible for not detecting activities that their training and experience had never prepared them to recognize as possible? Martinez provided the answer that had been crafted by legal advisors who understood the political necessity of accepting responsibility while minimizing personal culpability. This incident represents a failure of institutional planning rather than individual performance. Our security protocols were adequate for the threats they were designed to address. The Altiplano breach has revealed the need for expanded threat assessment and enhanced security measures that account for previously unconsidered attack vectors. The answer acknowledged systemic problems while avoiding personal blame. It positioned the escape as a learning opportunity rather than evidence of incompetence. It suggested that the real issue was inadequate planning rather than inadequate execution of existing plans. But Representative Vasquez was not satisfied with institutional explanations that avoided individual accountability. Warden Santos was responsible for the security of Altiplano Prison during the 18 months this tunnel was under construction. Does he retain your confidence? The question was a trap. Expressing confidence in Warden Santos would suggest that massive security failures were acceptable as long as officials followed existing protocols. But withdrawing confidence would suggest that officials could be held responsible for threats they had no reasonable way to anticipate or prevent. Martinez chose the middle path that satisfied nobody but offended the fewest people. Warden Santos has served with distinction for over 20 years in the Mexican correction system. The Altiplano incident has revealed systemic vulnerabilities that extend far beyond any single facility or administrator. Personnel decisions will be made based on comprehensive review of all relevant factors rather than immediate political considerations. The hearing continued for 6 hours. Technical questions about tunnel construction methods, policy questions about security protocol reforms, budget questions about the cost of implementing enhanced monitoring systems at facilities throughout the federal correction system. But the fundamental questions remained unanswered. How do you secure territory that extends infinitely in all directions? How do you guard against threats that originate from dimensions you cannot see? How do you maintain authority over people who understand that authority has natural limits that can be precisely measured and systematically exploited? The tunnel had posed these questions in concrete terms that could not be dismissed as theoretical or academic. It had demonstrated that the Earth itself was not neutral territory, but contested space that belonged to whoever was willing to work in it most persistently and systematically. And those questions would outlast any hearing or investigation or reform program that attempted to address them through conventional administrative measures. They were questions about the relationship between surface and depth, between visibility and control, between the world authority could see and the world authority preferred to ignore. The committee recessed at 3 p.m. with promises to continue the investigation and implement reforms and ensure accountability. But the real conclusion had already been reached. The tunnel had changed the rules of the game permanently. It had established precedents that could never be fully erased and demonstrated possibilities that could never be completely prevented. Somewhere beneath the congressional hearing room, utility tunnels carried water and electricity and telecommunications cables between government buildings, infrastructure that had been built by legitimate contractors for authorized purposes, but infrastructure that existed in the same three-dimensional space that had been conquered beneath Altiplano Prison. The Earth waited, patient and permeable and ready to be shaped by anyone willing to invest the time and effort required to work in the dimension that authority found most difficult to observe and control. And in that waiting, in that permanent readiness to accommodate unauthorized purposes, lay the tunnel's most enduring legacy. Not just as a successful escape route, but as proof of concept for possibilities that extended far beyond any single prison or any single crisis or any single congressional hearing room where officials promised reforms that could never fully address the fundamental vulnerability that had been revealed. The tunnel breathed beneath the hearing room. It breathed beneath every government building and every secure facility, and every promise of total control that had ever been made by people who understood security in 2 dimensions while operating in a world that contained 3. The reign started on September 15th, 3 months after the congressional hearings ended and 2 months after the last emergency protocols had been implemented at facilities throughout the Mexican correction system. It fell steadily for 6 days, soaking into the earth with the persistence of water that understood patience better than any human organization. In the basement of Altiplano prison, moisture sensors detected the first signs of seepage on September 18th. Not flooding, not structural failure, just the slow, inevitable movement of groundwater through soil that had been cut and carved and modified in ways that altered its natural drainage patterns. The tunnel had changed how water moved through the earth, and now the earth was teaching the surface world about consequences. The emergency response team descended through the shower drain shaft on September 19th, with waterproofing equipment and portable pumps, and a growing understanding that they were not dealing with a maintenance problem, but with a fundamental alteration of the local geology. The tunnel had been designed to remain dry during normal weather conditions, but normal weather conditions had ended the moment someone had carved a mile-long void through soil that had been stable for thousands of years. Engineer Patricia Morales stood knee-deep in muddy water at the tunnel's lowest point, watching her headlamp beam reflect off a surface that had been perfectly dry when the forensic teams had completed their analysis 3 months earlier. The water was clean, no sewage contamination, no chemical runoff, just groundwater following new paths that had been created by human hands and now operated according to laws of physics that recognized no authority except gravity and pressure and time. "It's not a leak," she radioed to the surface team. "It's a feature. The tunnel is collecting runoff from approximately 40 hectares of surface area and concentrating it at this elevation. We've accidentally built a drainage system." The implications were more complex than flood management. The tunnel had demonstrated its own permanence by changing how the local environment functioned. It had become part of the natural infrastructure of the valley, a component of the water cycle that would continue to operate regardless of human intentions or administrative decisions. You cannot simply ignore a mile-long concrete tube that collects and channels groundwater. You cannot pretend it doesn't exist because it was built without authorization. Nature doesn't respect permits or security protocols or congressional oversight. Nature adapts to whatever modifications humans make to the landscape and then continues to operate according to principles that were established long before governments existed. Above ground, Warden Santos stood in the rain outside Block 7, watching water pool in areas that had never flooded during his 8 years at the facility. The tunnel's ventilation system was creating subtle changes in air pressure that affected how precipitation moved across the prison grounds. The electrical connections were drawing power for lights that illuminated a space no legitimate user would ever occupy. The rail system was providing structural support for soil that might otherwise have collapsed and created sinkholes throughout the complex. The tunnel had become load-bearing infrastructure. Removing it would require rebuilding significant portions of the prison from the foundation up. Sealing it completely would create hydrostatic pressure that could damage the main building. Leaving it operational meant accepting that unauthorized infrastructure had become a permanent component of a maximum security facility. Santos had been expecting his termination notice for 3 months. The congressional hearings had made clear that someone would be held accountable for the security failure that had made Mexico a subject of international ridicule. But termination had been delayed while investigators tried to understand the full scope of what they were dealing with. Now he understood why. You cannot fire someone for failing to prevent something that continues to operate successfully despite all efforts to eliminate it. You cannot hold officials responsible for threats that have proven more durable than the security measures designed to contain them. The tunnel had outlasted the crisis it had created. It had survived the investigations and the hearings and the emergency protocols and the promises of reform. It had become a permanent part of the landscape, as integral to the prison's infrastructure as the electrical system or the plumbing or the concrete foundation that had been built above it. In Mexico City, Deputy Director Carmen Ruiz reviewed reports from similar incidents at 3 other federal facilities. Not escape attempts, not security breaches, just discoveries. Tunnels that had been built years earlier and abandoned before completion. Underground chambers that had been excavated for unknown purposes and then sealed. Unauthorized infrastructure that existed beneath official buildings throughout the capital. The Altiplano Tunnel had not been an isolated project. It had been the successful example of a methodology that was being applied systematically across multiple sites by organizations that understood underground construction as a strategic capability rather than a desperate expedient. Ground-penetrating radar surveys were revealing anomalies beneath facilities that had been considered completely secure. Electrical consumption audits were identifying power draws that could not be accounted for by authorized systems. Geological assessments were discovering soil disturbances that indicated extensive excavation activity dating back years or decades. Mexico's underground had been colonized, not recently, not in response to any specific security crackdown or enforcement initiative, systematically, over time, by people who understood that subsurface space was contested territory that could be claimed by whoever was willing to work in it most persistently. The problem was not limited to prisons. It extended to government buildings, military installations, border control facilities, and commercial infrastructure throughout the country. The tunnel beneath Altiplano had revealed the existence of a parallel world that operated beneath the official world and followed different rules than the ones that governed surface activities. Ruiz opened a classified file that contained information too sensitive for congressional hearings or public disclosure. Intelligence reports from agencies that had been quietly investigating subterranean activities for years without sharing their findings with corrections officials. Military assessments of tunnel networks that crossed international borders. Law enforcement analyses of underground transportation systems that connected major cities throughout North America. The Altiplano escape had not revealed a new threat. It had revealed an existing threat that had been developing beneath official notice for years, while surface authorities focused on horizontal and vertical security measures that ignored the third dimension entirely. The classified reports described tunnel networks that extended for hundreds of kilometers, underground chambers large enough to house vehicles and equipment, subterranean communication systems that operated independently of surface-based infrastructure, an entire shadow economy that moved goods and people through spaces that existed beneath the reach of traditional law enforcement. These were not crude smuggling tunnels dug by desperate individuals. These were industrial facilities built by organizations with access to heavy equipment, technical expertise, and financial resources that rivaled anything available to legitimate construction companies. Organizations that understood engineering as a discipline and applied it to problems that required systematic solutions implemented over long time horizons. The tunnel beneath Altiplano had been a single example of a much larger phenomenon, a proof of concept that demonstrated capabilities that extended far beyond any individual escape attempt. A sample of infrastructure that revealed the existence of an alternative transportation network that operated according to different rules than the surface world. And that network was still growing, still expanding, still being improved and extended by people who understood that patience and engineering could accomplish things that force and desperation could not. People who worked in the dimension that authority found most difficult to observe and control. On October 3rd, seismic monitors installed throughout the Altiplano complex detected vibrations consistent with underground construction activity. Not in the discovered tunnel, but in a different area beneath the facility. New excavation, new infrastructure, new proof that the original tunnel had been just the beginning of a larger project that continued to operate despite all efforts to detect and prevent it. The vibrations occurred during the night shift when ambient noise levels were lowest and seismic equipment was most sensitive. They followed patterns consistent with careful excavation using hand tools and techniques designed to minimize detection. They suggested the presence of people who understood exactly what they were doing and had learned from the experience of operating undetected beneath one of Mexico's most secure facilities. Warden Santos received the seismic reports at 6 a.m. on October 4th. He read them twice before placing them in a secure file cabinet that had been installed specifically to contain documents related to ongoing subterranean security threats. Documents that described problems that had no obvious solutions and threats that had no clear countermeasures. The tunnel had proven that underground infrastructure could be built and operated beneath maximum security facilities without detection. The new seismic activity suggested that the lesson had been learned and was being applied to additional projects by people who understood that success could be repeated if the methodology was sound and the execution was patient. Santos had been a corrections professional for 22 years. He had managed riots and escape attempts and security crises that had tested every aspect of his training and experience. But none of his training had prepared him for threats that originated from dimensions that were not supposed to contain threats. None of his experience had taught him how to secure territory that extended infinitely in all directions through space that could not be observed directly. The tunnel had changed the fundamental nature of his job. Prison security was no longer about controlling two-dimensional movement through three-dimensional space. It was about controlling three-dimensional movement through four-dimensional space-time by adversaries who understood that patience could accomplish things that force could not. But patience was not a resource that corrections officials possessed in unlimited quantities. Political pressure demanded immediate results. Budget cycles required annual accountability. Congressional oversight expected problems to be solved rather than managed indefinitely. The institutional framework that governed prison administration was designed for problems that could be addressed through conventional means, rather than problems that required thinking in dimensions that conventional means could not reach. The tunnel represented a category of problem that the Mexican correction system was not equipped to handle. Not because the people were incompetent or the resources were inadequate, but because the problem itself operated according to principles that the system had never been designed to account for. Underground infrastructure could not be defeated by surface-based security measures. Subterranean threats could not be eliminated by aerial surveillance or perimeter fencing or camera networks. Three-dimensional problems could not be solved by two-dimensional thinking, no matter how much money or effort was applied to the attempt. The tunnel had revealed the existence of contested space that extended beneath every building, every facility, every promise of security that had ever been made by people who understood control in terms of horizontal and vertical dimensions while operating in a world that contained depth as well as height and width, and that space would remain contested permanently. The tunnel had established precedents that could never be completely erased and demonstrated possibilities that could never be entirely prevented. It had proven that the Earth itself was not neutral territory, but active space that could be claimed and shaped by anyone willing to invest the time and effort required to work in the dimension that authority found most difficult to observe and control. The rain continued through October. Water moved through the tunnel according to principles of physics that recognized no authority except the laws that governed pressure and temperature, and the movement of fluids through spaces designed to accommodate them. The concrete walls channeled runoff from storms that had not yet occurred toward destinations that had not yet been reached through infrastructure that would continue to operate long after everyone who had built it was dead. The tunnel breathed. It drained. It supported the weight of the Earth above it and distributed that weight according to engineering principles that had been applied correctly the first time and would continue to function correctly for decades or centuries after the immediate crisis had been forgotten. It had become permanent, not because anyone had decided it should be permanent, but because it had been built to be permanent by people who understood that underground infrastructure, once properly constructed, operated according to geological time rather than political time. It would outlast the administrations that had tried to eliminate it, and the investigations that had tried to understand it, and the reforms that had tried to prevent similar construction in the future. The Earth remembered every cut, every modification, every alteration to its natural state, and the Earth continued to function according to its new configuration, regardless of human intentions or official policies or administrative decisions about what should or should not exist beneath the surface of the modern world. In the tunnel, air continued to move according to principles of convection that had been established by people who understood physics as a tool that could be applied to unauthorized purposes. Water continued to flow according to gradients that had been calculated by people who understood engineering as a discipline that could be practiced in spaces where legitimate authorities preferred not to look. And beneath the entire Mexican correction system, the Earth waited, patient and permeable and ready to be shaped by anyone willing to invest the time and effort required to work in the dimension where authority was weakest and possibilities were limited only by imagination, persistence, and the fundamental laws of physics that govern the behavior of matter in three-dimensional space. The tunnel had become proof of concept for a methodology that could be applied anywhere by anyone who understood that control over surface territory did not automatically extend to the space beneath the surface. Anyone who understood that patience and engineering could accomplish things that force and authority could not. Anyone willing to think in three dimensions while their adversaries remained focused on two. The rain stopped on October 31st, but the water continued to move through underground channels that had been carved by human hands and now operated according to natural laws that would continue long after human civilization had ended, and the surface world had returned to whatever configuration the Earth preferred when left to its own devices. The tunnel had become part of nature, permanent infrastructure that would endure through political changes and administrative reforms and budget cycles and congressional hearings and all the surface activities that humans used to convince themselves they controlled their environment. But the Earth controlled itself, and now the Earth included modifications that had been made by people who understood that the most durable changes were the ones made quietly, patiently, and far enough below the surface that they would not be discovered until they had already become irreversible facts of the physical world. The tunnel was forever,